December the 16th marks the 40th anniversary of China and the U.S. signing of the Joint Communique on the establishment of diplomatic relations. It is one of the three crucial joint communiques that laid the foundation for bilateral relations. During the past 40 years, bilateral relations between the two countries have fostered economic and social development for people in both nations. But China and U.S. ties these days are now facing challenges on many fronts. Against that current backdrop, with the need for mutual respect at all levels has become ever more urgent. Take a look.
The story began in 1971 when former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger made his first visit to China, opening a new chapter in the China-U.S. relations. Kissinger met with Zhou Enlai, and the then Chinese premier expressed his hopes for improved bilateral ties. This trip paved the way for the groundbreaking 1972 meeting between the then U.S. President Richard Nixon and Chinese Chairman Mao Zedong, ending 23 years of diplomatic isolation and mutual hostility. At the conclusion of this trip, China and the U.S. signed the Shanghai Communique, the first communique between the two sides. In the document, both nations pledged to work toward the full normalization of diplomatic relations. The U.S. acknowledged that there was only one China and that Taiwan is part of China. Both sides agreed to respect each other's national sovereignty and territorial integrity, and the two nations agreed to take action against any country establishing hegemony in the Asia-Pacific. The second communique was an achievement of the then U.S. President Gerald Ford's visit to China in December 1975. Known as the Joint Communique on the Establishment of Diplomatic Relations, this document formally announces the commencement of normal relations between the two nations. In doing so, the U.S. reiterated its stance on recognizing only one China. In addition, Washington also declared it would end formal political relations with Taiwan. Both sides reaffirmed their wish to reduce the risk of international conflict. On January 1, 1979, China and the United States officially opened their diplomatic relations at the ambassadorial level. In the same year, at the invitation of the then U.S. President Jimmy Carter, then Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping's first visit to Washington raised bilateral ties to a new level. The two governments issued the Third Communique on August 17, 1982. This document reaffirmed the desire of both sides to further strengthen economic, cultural, educational, scientific, and technological ties. Both sides also reaffirmed the statements made about the Taiwan issue in the previous communique. Washington declared its intent to gradually decrease its sale of arms to Taiwan. The three joint communiques between the two nations have always been the foundation for bilateral ties.
On December the 18th, 1978, just 2 days after the joint communique of the establishment of China-U.S. diplomatic relations was published, China's leaders decided on a new course of reform and opening up at the Third Plenary Session of the 11th CPC Central Committee. How did China's policy of opening up affect relations with the United States and vice versa? Recently, I sat down with Yuan Peng, the president of China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. He says the connection between the two is more than certain.
Ups and downs is a rule of U.S. and China relations. I still remember that this year is the 40th anniversary of the second U.S.-China communique on the normalization of the relations. Almost the same dates with the initiation of Chinese opening up and reform, which means the two great events, U.S.-China normalization and reform and opening up, happened almost same time. They have their logic. Without the normalization of the relations, we won't have opening up and reform, because to whom we open up? On the other hand, without the great decision of the opening up and reform, I don't think U.S.-China normalization will be ended during that time. So those two great events, have some interlinked at the very beginning. The past 40 years show that, on the one hand, Chinese opening up and reform is a very successful end. That is China from the underdeveloped country to number 2 economy in the world. But don't forget, we have another successful story. That is the U.S.-China relations. The problem is that after 40 years of the two great successes, now we're entering another 40 years.
That is exactly the question I want to ask you about. Will the two events, will the two issues still be closely linked with one another?
40 years ago, the interlink that is that the U.S.-China relations normalization is very useful for Chinese opening up and reform. We need American investment. America needs Chinese market. They embrace China into American-led international order. They thought they want to drag China in so that to change China. But the 40 years history showed that China is successful, but Chinese social system, political system remain, and we have more confidence than before. Then some Americans feel, uneasy, feel disappointed, even feel frustration. Then they want to have some new strategy. But the 40 years of the history told us U.S.-China relations, Chinese development, Americans' development, those things are highly, linked with each other.
Global governance is one thing, but what about the other aspect of China-U.S. relations? For the bilateral issue, whether it is trade, whether it's geopolitics, or the roles that the two countries will play in the region, for example, Asia-Pacific, while the U.S. was saying Indo-Pacific, is a big question marks facing all of us today, one after another. Professor Yuan, your thought?
Yeah, Asian-Pacific is our surrounding areas, but also viewed by the states as is, core national interest places. President Trump opposed everything that President Obama initiated, but one thing, he has more continuity than change. That he still put his strategic focus in this region, using another term, Indo-Pacific. So which means the first time in history, at least in past 50 or 60 years, and maybe next 30 years, American will put Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific as its strategic focus. This is a very big change. And from American perspective, China is an Asian-Pacific power, now much more powerful. President Xi said that Pacific is wide enough, can have both U.S. and China and other powers to play together, while American didn't respond that very positively, which means American didn't prepare strategically and psychologically to the new arrival of China. So how to find a new roadmap, how to find the new rule for U.S. and China live peacefully in Asia-Pacific is a common task for both U.S. and China. So this is not so far misperception. So if you will have a comprehensive understanding of today's China, you need to readjustment your mindset. So both U.S. and China will need mutual adjustment, not strategically, but psychologically.
That's very interesting, the phrase you just used, Professor Yuan, mutual adjustment. To the U.S. side, you mentioned about several things that it should adjust to when it comes to the realities of China and the possible approach that the U.S. could adopt vis-a-vis China. But what about from the Chinese side, the adjustment?
From Chinese side, number one, I think we should have very clear understanding of Chinese new identity in the world.
And which is?
Which is now we are number 2 economy, we are, relatively speaking, we are much stronger country in the world than years before, than decades before. So any decision made by Chinese government, you should have built in your mind that we're easily to arouse the international reaction. How to be more capable in engaging the global governance, working with major countries, working with the partners in the world to jointly manage the difficulties that we all faced in the future.
There's different levels of issues strategically that the two countries need to think about. We used to have a description of the exact nature of these bilateral relations. We also have mutually agreed different principles about how things will be done when we have difficulties, and certainly the ways to resolve them technically. But now it seems that everything has to start from scratch.
Yeah, this is not good news for both countries, because in the past 40 years we have ups and downs. We have a positive story and negative stories. We have competition, but we also have cooperation. But today, the narrative of, in particular from American media, academic, even think tank reports, and even the top leaders' statements show that competition is the only part of the relations, which is not true. So this is worrisome for me to see. I think it's time for both sides to sitting down, to go beyond some technical issues like trade, like South China Sea, like DPRK nuclear issues, to think about some big picture of the relations, new framework, new roadmap. Otherwise, without the new framework, the relations will be easily dragged to some, pieces to make the relations led by negative stories, negative, reactions.
Right. I understand you, as the head of Kicker, have been working with your American counterparts, different think tanks, to discuss those issues. Now, if you could, together with others, provide some advice or suggestions to the top leaderships of these two countries, what's going to be next 40 years?
Number one, I think, for us, is how to review the past 40 years. The past 40 years, why U.S.-China relations, we didn't have hot war, cold war, and the trade relations booming, and people-to-people exchanges flourishing. We have lots of good experiences that can be drawn to guide the futures, like people-to-people relations, like the crisis management, like the head of states diplomacy, like the mechanism building up establishments, like make the economic and the trade relations is the cornerstone of the relations. Lots of experiences. So it's time for the think tankers to draw those lessons and good experiences together. This is the first thing that we should bear in mind. And secondly, we need some new guideline, new framework, because the relations now have a radical change.
Apparently,
and also both domestic politics and also the whole international structure, international relations, environment, international environment. So beyond the 3 joint communiques and several joint statements, which is a big guideline of the relations, still works, but not enough. We need some new thinking.
Like what?
Like, for example, President Xi several years ago initiated the so-called new model or new type of major power relations.
But that did not get much response from the U.S. side.
I think it's a tragedy. So far, I still think it's a very wise initiative, because the 3 major contents of this still works. No conflict, no confrontation, mutual respect, win-win cooperation. So if you don't have positive response to Chinese initiative, then okay, we welcome American to have your own positive initiative, rather than just blame China, rather than just say some bad words about China.
Which doesn't help.
Which doesn't help. So if you do want to have a Cold War against China, that's one thing. If you do want to move the relations forward, then we can jointly initiate some positive initiative. And thirdly, I think we need to put the crisis management in up to a strategic level, because we cannot afford any kind of crisis in South China Sea, Taiwan Straits, even in financial and trade aspects. We need crisis management. And fourthly, maybe we should focus on our energy and resources on finding some cooperative areas.
Like what? Once again.
Like the dinner meeting between the two leaders talking about the cooperation on the drugs and tunnel, like DPRK nuclear issue, like trade, like WTO, new round of the WTO reform, like global governance cooperation, climate change. If we focus more time on cooperative side, then we'll be offset to those negative picture. And finally, I think people-to-people relations, local-to-local relations, mule-to-mule relations matters, because the relations is so complicated, cannot be just led by the head of state, cannot be just led by the foreign affairs or State Department. It's an all-round work. So if different aspects working closely in the daily basis, so I don't think U.S.-China relations bound to go to the so-called Thucydides trap.
Professor Yuan, it's such a pleasure talking to you, particularly now when the world is thinking where the two largest economies, their bilateral relations is going. Thank you so much, sir, for being with us.
Thank you.